Ukraine has hit at least 2 Russian oil refineries as President Biden finally signs off a $61 billion lifeline to keep Ukraine's armed forces in the fight.
Kharkiv again, and this is the scene of yet. We're in Kharkiv again.
My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defence editor of The Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. We're going to start with that American aid bill because as we speak, the first weapons from America are due to be arriving in Ukraine after a months-long deadlock in Washington finally came to an end. Hard to overstate how important that is. $61 billion of American military aid is on its way to Ukraine. Kyiv has been waiting for that since December, but it's been held up by Republican opposition in the House of Congress. The Republican Congress leader, Mike Johnson, backed down at the weekend. The House of Representatives voted it through. It then went through the Senate and it was signed off finally by President Biden in the White House, who said that America had finally risen to the occasion, but he stressed the need to move fast. And the message from his national security spokesman was that the situation in Ukraine was pretty bleak. Russia, in many parts of the front line, has momentum, and he also stressed the need to reverse that and to demonstrate to Vladimir Putin that he cannot wait this conflict out. He cannot rely on Western resolve. Fracturing and certainly a show of Ukraine's determination and indeed Ukraine's reach and capability, as we've seen before, is this latest strike on oil refineries. At least two refineries hit, one in Voronezh, we understand, and spectacular footage coming out of Smolensk, hundreds of miles north of the Ukrainian frontier, just east of Belarus. This has been a long-running campaign. We've talked about it a bit before, about how Ukraine is trying to grind down Russia's resilience, grind down its industrial base, which is enabling it to carry on fighting. And that's important. And the aid is important because as we look forward to what might come next, the head of Ukraine's military intelligence service, the spy chief Kyrylo Budanov, has issued a fairly chilling warning that things are hard and they're going to get harder. He singled out mid-May to early June as when he predicts Russia will launch what he described as a comprehensive campaign, not just on the front lines, not just in Kharkiv, not just in Donbass and in Kherson in the south, but across the entire country. The suggestion being that there may be a long-planned and even more substantial and devastating missile blitz heading Ukraine's way. We've seen in recent weeks a renewed vigor in Moscow's aerial bombardments as they targeted civilian infrastructure, as they deliberately tried to take out energy, power stations, heating infrastructure. And so more of that predicted. But he did say, Budanov's message, the spy chief's message was that it will be hard, but it will not be Armageddon, and Ukraine will prevail. Since our last update, it's worth noting a few of the other developments, and particularly I'd like to look a little bit at Kharkiv, Ukraine's second city, where a major TV mast was knocked down. Fairly dramatic images of that as well, although officials saying very limited casualties. It's significant because hitting communications towers, television broadcasting points is often seen as a precursor to an invasion. We've seen similar tactics in the run-up to this invasion when Russia launched a sort of cyber attack across Ukraine. The ability of the government in any country, but in Ukraine, to communicate with its people during a conflict, to let them know what is happening and what they need to do to try and stay safe is crucial. In an information vacuum, which Russia might try to create, then panic and fear will spread. And this attack on that TV mast in Kharkiv has fueled concern and expert speculation that Russia might be planning another offensive on Ukraine's second city. Of course, the northern edge of Kharkiv is just 15 miles from the Russian border. It's incredibly close. Before the war, it had very close cultural ties to Russia and to neighboring Belgorod city and province. On the first day of the full-scale Russian invasion more than 2 years ago, Kharkiv repelled a Russian tank assault. I was there the day after. I saw the evidence. I saw the destroyed, the blown-up Russian tanks on the city's ring road. But since then, since that day, Kharkiv has endured almost non-stop daily and nightly missile and drone bombardments. It has borne the brunt of Russia's fury. But the city has shown extraordinary resilience. I mean, resilience that we've seen across Ukraine, but the last time I was there, children were going to school in the metro stations, these spectacular, beautiful, beautifully built metro underground stations in Kharkiv had been transformed into classrooms, a platform subdivided into 5 or 6 classrooms. That's the sort of things people in that city have done to endure, to survive. But recently, the attacks on the television mast, before that, attacks on energy infrastructure, have raised concerns that something more could be coming. Of course, we also have to understand that Russia would be deliberately ahead of any offensive trying to disguise where that attack might come, and any focus on one particular area could in fact be a diversion. But nonetheless, there is concern that Kharkiv may soon face a renewed offensive, and it's worth us keeping an eye on what's happening there. A couple of other things worth noting. The Ukrainians have managed to shoot down a Tupolev 22M strategic bomber. Now, Britain's Secretary of State for Defence, Grant Shapps, called this an immense breakthrough, and Britain's Defence Intelligence Unit said it was almost certain that this plane was shot down by an S-200 air defence missile. This is significant. It was the first time this kind of aircraft had been shot down. These are strategic bombers, long-range bombers that have sweep-back wings, a bit like the old RAF Tornadoes, that their wings can move positions depending on what role they are performing. And significant, this description of the S-200 missile being involved, because that's an old Soviet-era missile that Ukraine has in its arsenals. Indeed, that maybe more of those weapons available, not just in Ukraine's arsenals, but around the world from militaries that used or use Soviet manufactured weaponry, and significant that they've managed to repurpose it, or at least engineer it, fire it in such a way that can hit a high-value Russian target. And of course, in the aid that is coming from America, we are expecting to see more air defense missiles like the S-200, but more sophisticated air defense missiles as well, particularly the US Patriot system, both, we hope, more batteries, more systems, including the radars and the launchers, but also more missiles to supply the Patriot systems that are already there. Along with that massive tranche of American aid, the United Kingdom has announced another 500 million to go to Ukraine this year. That brings the UK's contribution in terms of military aid up from £2.5 billion to £3 billion. And I understand that included in that latest tranche of aid will be more Storm Shadow cruise missiles. We know they've played a crucial part hitting high-value Russian targets in Crimea, hitting warships, hitting air defense batteries, hitting the headquarters of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, and also pave way for laser-guided bombs that can be fired from Ukraine's aircraft, again, that can hit high-value targets. So across the front, the situation remains tough. The message both from inside and outside Ukraine is that the fight is bleak. Russia has had momentum, but there is good news in terms of what's happening in the political sphere. The money's been signed off. More weapons are coming to Ukraine. That may well provide a much needed boost to morale, as well as a boost to Kyiv's weapons stockpiles. We know that over the last 5 months, many of the guns have fallen silent. Soldiers have had to ration ammunition. Air defenses have been scarce and in some cases unable to defend cities. That has changed. The other thing I wanted to talk about today is what's been happening in Moscow, where one of Russia's deputy defense ministers, Timur Ivanov, appeared in court on charges of bribery, charged under a section of the law for accepting a bribe worth more than 1 million rubles, about £8,000. But of course, we're not sure how large the bribe could be. Timur Ivanov has denied that. What's interesting, perhaps more interesting though than the charges itself, was how swiftly he appears to have been detained and produced in court. When we saw him behind the glass box, as defendants are routinely placed in Russian courts, he was wearing his sort of full military regalia, complete with general stars and medals on his chest. A sort of humiliation for Ivanov, a humiliation in some sense to Russia's Ministry of Defense. He's one of 12 deputy ministers who serve underneath Sergei Shoigu. Shoigu, the defense minister, is a close ally of Putin. Ivanov was in charge of a part of the Ministry of Defense which looked after military construction, potentially an area ripe for corruption. Interesting to see whether this is, whether he's a sacrificial lamb, what exactly is going on within the defense ministry. We have seen political machinations as people within that organization, both particularly in uniform, people affected by this conflict, involved in this conflict, have sort of knifed each other, stabbed each other in the back, clamoured and manoeuvred for advantage during the conflict. But so far, that manoeuvring has not dislodged the two people at the top, and that's General Gerasimov, the Chief of the General Staff, and Sergei Shoigu, the Minister of Defense. And whilst we're on the subject of Russia's courts, it's also worth noting that our colleague, Evan Gershkovich from the Wall Street Journal, appeared in court and was once again denied bail while he remains jailed in the notorious Lefortovo prison in Moscow on trumped-up spying charges. Evan denies the charges. His employers, the Wall Street Journal, deny the charges, as do the American Embassy, and the White House has accused Moscow of hostage diplomacy over this case and demanded his immediate release. As ever, if you've got any questions, if you're watching on YouTube, please write them in the comments below and we will do our best to answer them next week. We got lots of questions last time, a few that we've picked out. One of them is about seizing Russian assets. Why does the West and Ukraine's allies seem so nervous to do this? Now, just explain. There is a movement to try and use frozen Russian assets that belong to sanctioned entities and individuals across Western nations and banks to seize that money and to use it to fund Ukraine's war and potentially ultimately to fund the reconstruction of Ukraine to rebuild what's been damaged. There is concern, there is resistance from some quarters, and that seems largely to do with precedent. Many of the countries which hold these assets, including the City of London, including Swiss banks, are nervous that if they were to seize Russian money, then that, what precedent does that set for their own investments overseas, and crucially, will it deter other foreign investors from investing in their territories in future? Now, there is solid counter arguments for that. The direction it seems to be going at the moment is the momentum, most likely at the sort of first stage, would be to use the interest payments on these sanctioned entities and use that money rather than the capital itself. And I think my understanding is that can be justified because the interest payments to sanctioned entities are potentially illegal because you can't do business, you can't pay a sanctioned individual or an entity, and therefore that interest is not accruing, or at least not accruing to those people and to those companies. So that might be where the first finance from seized Russian assets comes from. But the resistance to it, the concern is about setting precedents and deterring international investment in Western institutions in future. There was a question about UK aid to Ukraine and will the UK supply more Challenger tanks. The UK has supplied 14 so far. We know that one has been destroyed. I managed to spend some time with the Challenger squadron earlier this year, and they were talking both about the tank's strengths, incredibly accurate, It has the record for the longest ever tank-on-tank kill in conflict. Is the UK going to send more? It's possible, but I certainly haven't picked up any whispers of that or intent. The main purpose and the main role that those 14 Challenger tanks played when they were pledged last year was to break a taboo, if you like. Up to that point, no nation had donated Western main battle tanks to Ukraine. The tanks that Ukraine really wanted were the German-made Leopard 2s, and those German Leopard 2s have been exported to many countries across Europe, but Germany, Berlin, was refusing permission for them to be re-exported to Ukraine, and that's because Germany has for a long time had concerns about being seen to escalate this conflict. Chancellor Olaf Scholz wary of sort of direct confrontation with Russia. When Britain gave its squadron of Challenger 2s, that effectively pressured Germany to dropping its opposition, and then we saw other countries with Leopard 2s donating them. We saw Germany donating some itself, and we saw America donating its Abrams tanks as well. As far as I know, at the moment, no plans for more British Challengers to go. The UK, as I've touched on earlier, has announced an extra £500 million worth of aid, bringing to £3 billion the total for this current tax year, and there's a commitment and intention within the UK Ministry of Defence to commit to spending £3 billion on aid to Ukraine each year hereafter. Most of the aid that's going at the moment, we understand, is being focused. It includes hundreds of armoured vehicles, drones, munitions, about 1,400 munitions, large, heavy munitions, 4 million rounds of ammunition, most likely small arms ammunition, but also shells to be fired from the heavy guns. And separately, the UK has announced a massive programme of ramping up its own ammunition production capability, which will potentially benefit Ukraine. Final question, also about weapons supply, is are Ukraine's allies buying weapons off third countries? And the person writing this question mentioned Turkey. Specifically Turkey, I'm not sure what's happening with weapon supplies from there, but I do know more broadly that absolutely a lot of the money which is earmarked for Ukraine by Ukraine's allies is spent on buying weapons in from third countries. So specifically what we saw at the beginning, for example, was those countries which had Soviet-era artillery guns in their arsenals. Pakistan, for example, many countries across Africa that had used Soviet guns also had stockpiles of Soviet ammunition, and that was bought up. At the moment, there are ongoing discussions about where to source Patriot air defense systems from. That's what Ukraine most desperately wants, is these sophisticated air defense systems to protect its skies. And within Ukraine's allies, I know there are discussions working out, who has them and who can spare them. And those conversations tend to come down to, were one country to donate its air defences, could another, a neighbour or an ally, supplement it? And for example, that is why you've seen the UK early warning radars, the Giraffe radars deployed to Poland to bolster its defences and its situational awareness as it sits on Ukraine's western border. That's all today. Thank you for watching. As I said before, if you do have questions, please write them in the comments below. One last thing I was going to comment on. A lot of your comments from last week's episode were discussing the use of careering towards or careening towards when I talked about careering towards World War III. My understanding, and to the pedants, is that both words can be used accurately. Careening initially refers to as a word that was to bring a ship out of water. Careering, although it does describe our career paths these days, originally, according to the Merriam-Webster American Dictionary, was a medieval word that traces its roots to jousting and the journey of a jousting knight. I hope very much that we are neither careening nor careering to World War III. But as those of you who watch this programme know, it remains a real risk given the state of what's happening in Ukraine and elsewhere in the world. Thank you again. If you do have questions, please write them in the comments and we'll try and answer them next week.